What's happening? Adam Drake here, and today I'm going to show you the electronics that I use, and then I'm going to go through kind of step by step the settings that I use in my speed controller in my MBX8 Eco buggy. So as far as what's powering the electronics, I have the ProTech 6000 milliamp 4S shorty battery. And then as far as electronics go, it's the Tekin RX8 Gen 3 speed controller with the Tekin 1900 kV Gen 3 motor, ProTech 170 SBL servo, and then what's controlling all that is the Futaba 7PXR radio system. As far as the gearing goes, on the electric buggy I use the stock Team Edition gearing as far as ring and pinion. So I have the 1344 ring and pinion front and rear. I do change it up a little bit in the center. I use either a 16-tooth pinion or a 16-tooth clutch bell if I'm using the clutch system. But the spur gear I use is a steel 44-tooth spur gear. So that's going to provide a little bit smoother initial power and a little bit more overall top speed. So the 1900 motor is kind of the go-to motor for electric buggy. In truggies you would run maybe like a 2250 or a little bit more, but with the 1900 it's plenty of power, but I still like smoothing out the power a little bit and giving it a little bit more top end with the 44-tooth spur gear. As far as the ESC settings, so I use the Tekin Hotwire, and then I just have an app on my phone from Tekin, and it allows me to plug the Hotwire in to the fan port, and then I can make adjustments through the app on my phone. Now, you can do a lot of adjustments through the ESC just with the standard programming button, and it kind of gives you a light sequence, and you can increase and decrease things. But I really highly recommend, if you have Tekin electronics, to download the app and then to have the Hotwire system. It just makes it really simple and easy. Again, you can do it right from your phone just by plugging it into the fan port. So I'm going to just kind of run down the settings that I use on my Hotwire. So for the cell count, I have that turned off. And I don't really recommend that for everyone else because it's much safer if you have the cell count turned on. What the cell count does is it's basically setting the voltage cutoff, or kind of like a safety feature within the speed controller. So if you're running a 4S battery, you should run the cell count at 4. If you're running a 2S battery, you should run it at 2. But for me, with racing, I want to make sure that that voltage never dips or goes slightly below kind of that voltage cutoff or safety feature, because I want to make sure that it goes all the way to the end. The problem with that is if you run the battery too low, you can damage the battery. But for me with racing, normally if I'm practicing, I'll just set a stopwatch, and in racing, normally I'm never going more than 10 minutes, which the ProTech 6000 milliamp battery pack has more than enough power and runtime to do multiple warm-up laps, do the 10-minute race. So I just want to make sure that I turn off that cell count to make sure that the speed controller never goes into that kind of safety or voltage cutoff mode. The BEC voltage, basically what that's doing is that's the amount of power that's going to be sent to the fan and also the servo. So I turn the BEC voltage up to 7.4 volts. That way it makes the servo speed the same for my Eco buggy as it is for my Nitro buggy. So in Nitro, I run a 2S LiPo battery with no regulator, and so it's providing 7.4 volts to the servo, and I want my electric car to drive as close to my Nitro car, so 7.4 volts makes the ProTech 170 SBL the same for both Nitro and electric. As far as motor direction, that's normal. Motor type is brushless forward only. If you're not racing, you can turn on reverse so that if you get stuck in a pipe, you can back off, but for racing, it's not allowed. The fan I always run on, but I actually don't run a fan. But what this is doing is providing power to the fan for when I want to plug in the hot wire. I just choose not to run a fan because the Tekin RX8 Gen 3 runs really cool. The fan sometimes can cause problems if a fan blade breaks or if a rock gets stuck in the fan. And if I was running in conditions where I felt like I was kind of getting close to that limit as far as temperature with the speed controller, I would run a fan. But I feel like I drive fairly smooth. I'm using a fairly mild motor. I never really feel like I'm close to that temperature threshold, so I just choose not to use a fan. In e-truggy, you're normally using a more powerful motor, you're driving it harder. It's probably a good idea to use a fan, but for e-buggy, no need to use a fan with the Tekin RX8 Gen 3. Data erase I have off. The drag brake I have set to 8%. And the reason for that is I feel like when the drag brake is at 0, it almost feels like the car kind of runs on a little bit. Like even though the throttle's not staying on, there's nothing that's kind of helping it slow down. I feel like when you go off jump, sometimes it almost feels like in a nitro car, like the engine was running on. So I usually run between 6 and 10%. Currently I have it set at 8% drag brake. So that's going to apply 8% of the brakes when I go back to neutral. That helps kind of set the front end, get the front end into the corner, gives it a little bit more off power steering, and also has what I feel is closer to my nitro feeling when I'm going off jumps. The brake minimum is at 1 because I want the brakes to be as smooth as possible initially. The brake strength. So brake strength is something that goes hand in hand with your brake EPA on your radio. So if you run a higher brake strength on the ESC setting, you would want to turn down the brakes to a lower EPA setting for the brake side on the radio. So currently I have my brake strength at 60%, and then on my radio, it depends on the track conditions, but normally my brakes will be between 70 and 85% on the radio when my brake strength is at 60%. And for some guys, like when I pick up their cars, I'll drive their car and their throttle is way more aggressive than what it needs to be, and also their brakes are more aggressive than what it needs to be. And it's because it comes down to the amount of grip we have on the track. If you have more grip, you can run more brakes. You can have more power through the throttle. But in most conditions, the tracks are medium to low grip on a lot of the nitro tracks. If I was running on an indoor clay track like OCRC, I might turn this brake strength up to 70 or 80%. But for most outdoor tracks, I run the brake strength at 60% because, again, the grip level is lower. If it's a lower grip level, you don't need as much brake. Push control is at 0. Brake frequency is at 2000. So I have a little bit more aggressive brake frequency, but again, I run the brake strength fairly mild and also the EPA a little bit lower on my radio. Throttle minimum and throttle neutral width, both of those are at 1. Again, I want the throttle to be very smooth and linear, so I want to make sure that that neutral width and throttle minimum starts as soon as I start to pull the throttle. I don't want there to be like additional deadband before the throttle comes in. Another thing that I do sometimes to smooth out the throttle is on the radio I'll run a little bit of negative expo, like maybe 10% negative expo. The throttle frequency I have at 10,000, which is pretty mild and smooth throttle setting. Again, most of the tracks we run on, you're trying to put the power to the ground, and a lot of times we're limited by the traction level or the surface that we're racing on. The torque setting, normally with the torque setting, I'm It could be anywhere between 6 and 10, but I would say in most conditions it's between 6 and 8. Currently I have the torque setting at 6%. That's, again, kind of on the mild side for me. But the last time I raced it was a little bit lower grip. I wanted a little bit broader power band and a little bit smoother initial power. So the torque setting is at 6. And the throttle timing I have at 5 degrees. So again, pretty mild. I like to try to have not a huge difference in power, overall power and power delivery between nitro and electric. It makes it easier to kind of transition back and forth between the two. And in most cases, there's not something on the track where that extra 10% of power is going to necessarily give you a faster lap time. You still have to control the car. So I feel like you want to make the car fast enough to where you can do all the jumps on the track, but smooth enough and mild enough to where you're still able to use the full range of the trigger. If you're having to be really mindful and careful to kind of never hit full throttle because the car's so fast, that just means it's going to increase the chance of you making mistakes. So I want to have a car to where it has the power delivery that's really smooth and linear, and to where I'm able to use the full range of the trigger. So hopefully some of these settings are something you can kind of play with and adjust with your Tekin RX8 Gen 3. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below or send me a message or email. And also feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much.